He thought it was just a joke, a $1 million dare between spoiled friends and whiskey-fueled ego. Marry an obese woman for a year, they said. Win the bet, walk away rich. So he did. But what Jace Langston didn't expect was the storm that would follow. The woman he mocked would become the mirror to his darkest flaws. And when she vanished without a word, the world noticed. Now, she's famous. He's forgotten. But what she tells him in their final meeting will haunt him forever. Would you still laugh if the bet destroyed you instead? Jace Langston wasn't just another millionaire, he was the poster child for arrogance, inherited wealth, and reckless ambition. At 32, he had everything that made the tabloids buzz. A six-pack sculpted for the camera, a social circle of influencers and heirs, and a smirk that carried more mischief than charm. His weekends were reserved for yacht parties, and his weekdays were filled with boardroom performances masquerading as business deals. But under the tailored suits and champagne smiles was a man who had never truly known loss or vulnerability. One evening, in the midst of a lavish poker night hosted in his Manhattan penthouse, Jace's intoxicated bravado led him into dangerous territory. His friend Simon, a hedge fund brat with even less moral compass than Jace, leaned in with a sneer and dropped the challenge. Bet you can't stay married to an obese woman for 1 year. Win, and I'll wire $2 million to your account the day the divorce is finalized. But she can't know. And it has to be real, wedding, cohabitation, everything. The room erupted with laughter. Jace, never one to back down from a dare, grinned and shook on it. It wasn't about the money, it was about the thrill, the control, the ego trip. That night, while nursing his third glass of bourbon, Jace's eyes fell on a woman he'd seen before but never truly noticed. She lived across the street, ran a small bakery, and often struggled with the bags she carried up her stoop. Her name was Mara Kinley. Obese, quiet, and clearly unaware of the cruel scrutiny now cast upon her by the man who would soon knock on her door. The next day, Jace accidentally bumped into her while jogging. He played it smooth, apologized, then asked her about her bakery. Mara, caught off guard, gave him a cautious smile and mentioned her new line of cinnamon brioche. Jace, with rehearsed sincerity, offered to stop by. And he did, again and again, playing the part of the curious admirer, slowly chipping away at her walls. Mara, who had endured years of rejection and societal judgment, was understandably hesitant. She had taught herself not to trust sudden kindness, not when it came from men like Jace. But he was persistent, attentive, and disarmingly charming. He listened to her stories, complimented her pastries, and laughed at her dry humor. Over time, his performance became almost seamless, even he started to believe the act. He introduced her to his simpler friends, curated outings to avoid suspicion, and painted a version of himself that was calm, grounded, and humble. Mara began to believe she had found something rare, a man who saw past her size. What Jace didn't realize was how dangerously close he was to being swallowed by the illusion he created. For the first time in years, someone wasn't falling for Jace Langston the millionaire, but for the man he was pretending to be. And that terrified him. Still, the wedding came. He proposed in front of a live-streamed flash mob outside her bakery, and the video went viral. Mara was speechless, the crowd was ecstatic, and Jace had secured his bet, publicly and permanently. Behind closed doors, though, he began documenting every moment, every milestone, sending it to Simon as proof that the plan was on track. He kept a hidden file labeled "The Bet." But Mara, ever intuitive, began noticing odd moments, his too perfect gestures, the scripted nature of some of their conversations, the fleeting glances he gave when he thought she wasn't watching. Something didn't add up. And while Jace thought he was in control, the seeds of a very different reckoning had already been planted. The wedding came quicker than anyone expected, and perhaps that was the point. Jace spared no expense, planning a grand ceremony at an ivy-covered estate in upstate New York, carefully orchestrating every moment to play perfectly on camera. The press caught wind of the viral proposal, and outlets eager to cover a real love story between a millionaire and a modest baker latched on. Invitations were carefully curated, just enough family and bakery friends to satisfy Mara, but with Jace's circle dominating the guest list. She walked down the aisle with tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by emotion, believing she had found her fairy tale ending. Jace, beneath his tuxedo and practiced smile, felt a strange mixture of triumph and nausea. Cameras flashed, drones hovered, and champagne poured while the whispers of his friends lingered beneath the music. Mara, radiant in a custom dress she had never imagined herself wearing, clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, her years of being unseen had ended. But behind the tender glances and choreographed affection, a darker truth loomed. Her husband was documenting their life like a research project, gathering data for a private audience of elite mockers who saw her as a punchline. As newlyweds, they moved into a brownstone Jace claimed he had recently bought for them, though in truth it had been staged, prepped, and signed under a trust tied to the bet. Every photo on the walls, every item in the closets, was carefully chosen to complete the illusion of domestic bliss. Mara, unfamiliar with opulence but not dazzled by it, found solace in cooking for them both, creating new recipes in the spacious kitchen, and crafting a home that felt real to her. Jace would sit at the island counter, pretending to take business calls while secretly recording snippets of her laughter, reactions, or routines to share in group chats titled with cruel nicknames. He justified it as harmless documentation, never allowing himself to face the ugliness of his actions. To her face, he was attentive, respectful, the man she had fallen for. But late at night, when she was asleep, he stared at the ceiling, wondering why her sincerity gnawed at him like guilt. At social functions, Mara noticed subtle shifts, his friends' forced politeness, the hollow compliments, the sidelong glances when she wasn't looking. At first, she chalked it up to nerves. She was the outsider in a world built on gloss and status. But gradually, inconsistencies emerged. Jace avoided letting her meet his family, claiming they lived abroad when in truth, they disapproved of the entire charade and had cut off contact. He cancelled joint interviews at the last minute, deflected questions about their relationship in public, and frequently dismissed her suggestions with a patronizing laugh. When she expressed interest in hosting a fundraiser at their home for a local food bank, he immediately shut it down, claiming it would expose them to gossip, though it was the growing attention he feared most. Still, Mara remained devoted. She decorated their home with warmth and whimsy, leaving little notes in his briefcase, stitching his initials into hand towels, and learning his favorite dishes by heart. Her love wasn't performative, it was quiet, steady, and real. It was everything Jace didn't deserve, but everything he was slowly growing addicted to. He began withdrawing from his friends' taunts, ignoring messages, and missing poker nights. The mocking laughter that once fueled him now made him sick. He caught himself watching her while she read on the couch, wondering what it would feel like to confess, to end the lie and start anew. But fear of ridicule, of admitting weakness to the men who had shaped his identity, kept him in place like chains around his chest. One evening, Mara found a receipt in his coat pocket, an invoice for a set of micro cameras, one of which had been disguised in a clock in their living room. Her breath caught, but she said nothing immediately. Instead, she began to observe. She replayed conversations, re-examined compliments, analyzed his reactions. A growing suspicion took root, quiet but relentless. She started locking her phone, password protecting her laptop, and asking subtle questions he failed to answer convincingly. Meanwhile, Jace noticed the shift in her energy and panicked. His friends had begun pressing him for the grand finale, the moment he would publicly dump her and claim his winnings. But Jace couldn't stomach it anymore. Every version of that ending felt hollow, monstrous. He was now the one who felt out of place, the one performing in a world he no longer belonged to. The weight of his deception crushed him more with each passing day. He deleted the group chat. He wiped the secret folder. He told himself that was enough to change the story. But it wasn't. The wedding had been a lie. The marriage was a lie. And even if his feelings were beginning to shift toward truth, the foundation had already begun to crack. Mara, once blissfully unaware, now moved through the house with silent calculation, like someone assembling a puzzle made of memories. Jace couldn't tell if he was falling in love with her, or simply losing the ability to separate lies from longing. In the stillness of the night, he watched her sleep, wondering when the moment would come that she would see him for what he truly was. Not a savior, not a partner, but the villain in her story. As autumn blanketed the city with gold and rust, Jace found himself unable to keep playing the role he had so confidently crafted. What had started as a one-year performance was now spiraling into something unpredictable. Mara had grown quiet in a different way, not timid, but observant, almost calculating. She smiled less, but when she did, it felt more deliberate, as if she was testing the weight of her own heart before offering it. Jace, meanwhile, began retreating from his old self. The group chats were silent. His poker nights, once sacred, became rare. For the first time in years, he had no witty quips, no perfectly timed smirks to hide behind. And in the silence, something unsettling happened. He began to see Mara. Not just the soft contours of her body or the way she sang quietly while baking, but the architecture of her strength, the quiet dignity that lived in her every move. He watched her mentor a struggling teen from the neighborhood, patiently teaching him how to make shortbread cookies in the bakery after hours. He saw how she comforted a customer who had just lost her husband by sitting with her long after the shop had closed. He noticed how the mailman always lingered to chat with her because she remembered his birthday and once baked him a lemon tart just because he mentioned he liked citrus. Beneath the weight she carried, both physical and emotional, was a woman who had built a life around care, grace, and grit. Jace started reading the book she kept by her bedside, one on emotional resilience, dog-eared and underlined in parts where her past pain had clearly left its mark. She had written tiny notes in the margins, like whispered thoughts to her future self. He began to understand that she wasn't naive or oblivious. She was a survivor of 1,000 tiny betrayals that the world casually inflicted on women who looked like her. He found himself drawn into her world, stepping behind the bakery counter when an employee called out sick, helping organize the shelves, even offering to hand-deliver orders. Each time he walked into her space, he found her surrounded by light, not pity. Her customers adored her, not out of sympathy, but because she had a way of making everyone feel seen, like their presence mattered. And the more Jace absorbed, the more he began to unravel. He wasn't just feeling guilt, he was beginning to question who he had become, who he had always been. The contrast between Mara's authenticity and his own carefully curated life was crushing. At night, he lay awake remembering childhood moments when he mocked his cousin for being overweight, how his father laughed at cruel jokes over dinner, how he had inherited cruelty like a suit tailored for him. And now, he was married to the very kind of person he once made the subject of a bet, a woman whose soul outshone his entire world. He caught himself wanting to protect her, not just from the truth of what he'd done, but from the callousness of the life he had dragged into her orbit. But it was too late. The truth was no longer something he could confess to erase. It was a stain that grew darker with time. One day, Mara surprised him by suggesting they attend therapy, not for any clear reason, just as a way to grow as a couple. Jace hesitated, then agreed, unsure if she was testing him or simply trying to reach him. In the sessions, she spoke with clarity about her insecurities, her past relationships, the slow burn of learning to believe she was worthy of love. Jace, by contrast, fumbled. He lied at first, then half-confessed to emotional distance, blaming his parents' coldness and a fear of vulnerability. The therapist watched them both carefully, asking few questions but jotting down many notes. Mara nodded through it all, offering kindness where none was earned. But behind her eyes, a storm was gathering. Jace had stopped sending updates to Simon and the others months ago, yet he hadn't deleted the old messages or wiped the cloud drive where the cruel videos still lived. He told himself it was cowardice, or maybe guilt, but in truth, he didn't know how to sever the final thread to the man he used to be. That thread, thin and poisonous, remained intact even as he sat across from Mara at dinner, listening to her talk about expanding the bakery or adopting a rescue dog. He wanted to say the words, to confess everything, to fall to his knees and beg forgiveness. But the shame was a muzzle he couldn't remove, and each day that passed made the silence heavier. Mara, for her part, began reclaiming parts of herself. She started swimming at a local pool, attending writing workshops, and rekindling old friendships that she had let slip during the honeymoon phase of their relationship. Jace watched as she began to glow in a new way, not from his attention, but from within. Then came the night of the charity gala. Mara had been invited to speak about small business impact, and Jace accompanied her as her guest. She wore a dark blue dress that shimmered under the chandeliers, and as she took the stage, Jace saw her in a way he never had before, not as the woman he married under false pretenses, but as someone who owned every part of her story. She spoke with conviction, thanking her community, her late mother, and her husband, for seeing the light in me even when I forgot it was there. Jace nearly choked on his wine. The guilt pressed down so hard he could barely breathe. He left the room mid-applause and stood in the garden, staring at his reflection in a pond, hoping it might drown the man staring back. In the weeks that followed, their life resumed its rhythms, but Mara's silences became sharper. She had begun checking his laptop. She found the hidden folder. She read everything. And yet, she said nothing. She woke up the next morning, made breakfast, and asked if he wanted to visit her sister over the weekend. Jace, unaware of her discovery, agreed. But Mara had changed. She no longer needed his validation. And for the first time in their relationship, she knew exactly who she was married to, and exactly who she was becoming. What Jace didn't realize was that the countdown had begun. She was no longer trapped in his lie. She was merely waiting for the moment to show him what he had truly gambled away. It happened on a Sunday morning, exactly 1 year to the day after their wedding. An anniversary that Jace had planned to celebrate with a lavish private chef dinner, tickets to a rooftop concert, and a diamond necklace that screamed repentance more than love. But Mara never made it to the restaurant. Instead, she sat silently on their couch, the curtains drawn, the room unnaturally still, with a printed copy of the email thread between Jace and his friends clutched in her trembling hand. It hadn't been a dramatic discovery. There was no explosion, no cinematic gasping moment. It was just a name, Simon, on a recently received voicemail notification. She recognized it immediately and tapped to listen. The voice, flippant and drunk, laughed about how Jace must be counting down to his $2 million payout and how Mara actually started to look kinda cute now. Her body froze as though submerged in ice. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She walked over to his study and calmly began opening files. The truth poured out with horrifying ease, videos, photos, time-stamped messages, sarcastic commentary on her weight, her cooking, even her laugh. She read until her vision blurred, until the screen became a blur of pixels and betrayal. When Jace returned home later that evening, humming and holding a bouquet of roses too perfect to be genuine, he found the house silent. The lights were dimmed, and the dining table was set, except only one chair was pulled out. Mara stood in the doorway of the study, still in her simple house dress, holding a folder with the label receipts written across it in bold red pen. Her face wasn't angry, it was empty. Jace's heart skipped as she handed it to him without a word. He opened it, saw the printouts, and felt the ground vanish beneath him. There was no escape, no justification, no spin he could throw at this moment. He tried to speak, but she cut him off with a single hand gesture. "Don't," she said, her voice hoarse from a day of silence. "You don't get to fix this with words." She didn't shout. That, somehow, hurt more. Instead, she packed a single duffel bag and left without saying where she was going. For 3 days, Jace didn't hear from her. Her phone rang, but went to voicemail. Her bakery was closed. Her social media silent. It was as if she had vanished. And for the first time in his privileged, manufactured life, Jace felt the hollow ache of abandonment. Not the kind that came with slammed doors, but the kind that left echoes in the walls. His friends, those who had cheered on the bet, laughed nervously when he confessed what had happened, but the air had shifted. The joke had ended, and Jace was the punchline. Simon went silent. The rest distanced themselves, embarrassed not for him but for their own proximity to scandal. Within a week, Jace's name trended on social media, not because he had leaked it, but because someone else had. Screenshots. Clips. The proposal. The wedding. The contrast between what the public saw and what was really happening was too grotesque to ignore. Influencers dissected it. Commentators tore into it. Feminist writers and relationship gurus went viral analyzing the emotional manipulation and fat phobia embedded in the story. Jace Langston became the embodiment of cruelty masked as romance. Brands pulled sponsorships. His investments tanked as partners withdrew. His face, once plastered on billboards, was now meme fodder. But Mara wasn't seen either. She had disappeared entirely. Until, exactly 1 month later, she emerged. Not in a scathing tell-all, not in a press conference, but in a quiet live stream from the reopened bakery. The camera was steady, the lighting natural, her voice calm. She didn't speak of Jace directly. Instead, she told a story about being conditioned to accept less, about how society teaches women like her to be grateful for any attention, even if it hurts. She talked about the beauty of rediscovering self-worth after betrayal. She thanked her community and ended the video by saying, "Healing doesn't come with a spotlight. Sometimes it just comes with a clean kitchen and the smell of warm bread." Millions watched. Tens of thousands commented. And not once did she mention his name. Jace, watching alone in his penthouse that now felt cavernous and cold, wept for the first time since childhood. Not out of pity for himself, but because he finally saw what he had destroyed. Not just a woman, but a universe that had welcomed him, trusted him, tried to love him. He reached out, but Mara never responded. Not to his messages, his letters, or his attempts to send restitution. She wasn't punishing him. She had simply moved on. In her absence, Jace spiraled. The money that had once felt infinite began to dry. Lawsuits followed from investors. Paparazzi haunted him. But what haunted him most was the quiet, the lack of her voice in his life, the missing humming in the kitchen, the notes in his jacket pocket. His world had always been loud, chaotic, performative. But Mara had brought warmth, a calm that made him feel human. Now, without her, he was just a man in a mirror he couldn't bear to look into. And he knew, no matter how much he rebuilt, there would always be a missing piece that no money, no trophy girlfriend, no public apology could ever fill. The woman the world had once overlooked became its quiet revolution. After her live stream went viral, Mara Kinley didn't chase the spotlight, it chased her. Book publishers called non-stop, her inbox flooded with interview requests, and media outlets clamored for exclusives. But she chose her moments with precision, declining every offer until one day, she accepted a single interview with a small local podcast hosted by a trauma counselor who had once been one of her customers. In that conversation, Mara spoke softly, yet with a presence that commanded attention. She described the bakery as her sanctuary, the oven as her therapist, and her recipes as love letters to the parts of herself that had once been silenced. When asked about the betrayal, she didn't name Jace or delve into tabloid-ready drama. Instead, she said, "Sometimes, the people who hurt us the most are the ones who taught us what parts of ourselves will never compromise again." That line alone became a rallying cry, printed on posters, shared across platforms, and etched into the skin of survivors who finally felt seen. Mara began writing, not just recipes, but essays, memoir entries, and reflections on self-worth, trauma, and the insidious ways society equates thinness with value. Her words were honest and raw, not crafted for applause but forged in truth. A literary agent picked up her work and, within weeks, a deal was signed. The book hit shelves 5 months later, titled The Weight of Grace. It wasn't a diet book, nor a revenge tale, it was a manifesto of reclamation. It detailed how she'd once shaped her life around acceptance from others, and how she was now building a future rooted entirely in her own terms. It sold out in days. Bookstores held midnight release events. Her readings became standing-room-only affairs. The chubby baker once dismissed as a punchline was now a symbol of strength, wisdom, and elegant defiance. Meanwhile, the bakery evolved. No longer just a neighborhood favorite, it became a hub of empowerment. Mara expanded it into a wellness cafe, offering not weight loss products, but workshops on intuitive eating, self-care, and cooking for the soul. She partnered with local therapists to host support groups in the evenings. The staff she hired included women of all sizes and backgrounds, many of whom had faced discrimination in other kitchens. She paid them well, gave them creative freedom, and created a space where no one had to shrink themselves, literally or metaphorically, to belong. Television producers soon came knocking with offers for a cooking show, and though she declined the first few, Mara eventually signed on for a digital series that aired weekly on a streaming platform. The show wasn't about perfect plating or Michelin star techniques, it was called Home Heat, and it focused on healing through food, storytelling, and creating safe spaces in the kitchen. Each episode opened with a quote from her book, followed by a new guest sharing their journey. And week by week, the audience grew. The visual change in Mara was undeniable, but not in the way most expected. She did lose weight, but it wasn't the transformation that defined her. What stunned people most was her energy, her posture, her glow. She carried herself like a woman reborn, not because she had shed pounds, but because she had shed shame. Her eyes, once wary and soft, now held fire. She smiled often, but with precision. She wore clothes that celebrated her form rather than concealed it, and her voice, once tentative, now filled auditoriums. She wasn't seeking revenge. She wasn't looking back. She was rising, slowly, steadily, undeniably. Jace, now drowning in lawsuits, public ridicule, and a self-loathing he no longer knew how to mask, watched from afar. He saw her face on billboards, her book in airport displays, her name trending beside words like powerful and transformational. Each sighting was a dagger. Not because she had moved on, but because she had moved up. He made one final attempt to reach her, writing a handwritten letter filled with apologies, admissions, and desperate pleas. He mailed it to the bakery. But Mara never opened it. She returned it, sealed, with a yellow post-it that simply read, "Closure is a solo journey." The note was in her handwriting, calm and direct, as though she'd already made peace with a part of her life that no longer needed explanation. Months passed, and Mara was invited to speak at a global summit on women's leadership. She shared the stage with political leaders, activists, and entrepreneurs, delivering a speech that wove personal pain into universal truth. She ended with a moment of silence, asking every woman in the room to think of the moment they realized they deserved better. The silence thundered. When she stepped down from the stage, the applause lasted minutes. Not because she had inspired pity, but because she had lit a path. Her success wasn't accidental. It wasn't a reaction to heartbreak. It was the culmination of a woman finally stepping into a light she had always deserved. She didn't need validation anymore, not from strangers, not from the media, and especially not from the man who once wagered her dignity for a payout. She had won a different game. One he never knew existed. One he never could have played. Jace Langston never thought he'd be forgotten. That was the cruelest part. Not the money lost, not the cancelled partnerships, not even the lawsuits from former business associates who claimed he misled them during the collapse of his personal brand. What gutted him most was the silence. The absence of his name in the headlines that used to hang off his every move. The way no one whispered when he walked into a room, because no one knew who he was anymore. Once the man who turned heads at every gala, Jace now kept a low profile, renting a modest apartment uptown after losing his penthouse. His wardrobe, once filled with tailored Italian suits, was now reduced to plain jeans and off-the-rack button-ups. The world had moved on. But he hadn't. Every step he took felt like penance. Every breath carried the weight of a woman's absence. She haunted him, not in nightmares, but in the daylight, in the bakery ad on a bus stop he passed every morning, in the excerpt from her book that someone quoted during a lecture he wandered into by accident. And though he never said it out loud, Jace carried a sliver of hope that one day, he might be granted a moment. Not a reunion. Not forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. A second in which she looked at him and saw the version of himself he never got to become. That moment came unexpectedly. It wasn't in a grand hall or a red carpet event. It was a city council hearing, one Jace had attended by coincidence, hoping to pitch a real estate rehabilitation project in a final effort to revive his dwindling name. Mara was there, representing a small business alliance proposing a countermeasure that would protect community-run spaces from being bought out by wealthy developers. When she walked into the room, calm and composed, the entire chamber seemed to straighten. She wore a black blazer and burgundy slacks, her hair pulled back, eyes focused, voice steady. She didn't acknowledge him, not even a flicker of recognition. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes, laying out her case with undeniable clarity. Jace sat in the back, stunned by her presence. This wasn't just the woman he had hurt, this was a woman he had never truly known. After the session ended, he stepped out into the corridor, heart thudding. She passed him as if he were a stranger. But as she walked by, she paused, turned slightly, and said without looking at him, "Funny how some people only find their voice when no one's listening anymore." Then she kept walking. It should have stung. Instead, it felt like closure, though not the kind he had hoped for. That night, Jace returned to his apartment and finally opened the sealed folder he had kept buried in his drawer for months, the legal contract tied to the original bet, the one signed by Simon and the rest, outlining the conditions of the dare that had changed everything. He stared at it, then ripped it to shreds, each tear echoing like a scream in the silence. But Mara had already known. What Jace hadn't realized was that weeks earlier, her lawyers had filed a quiet claim. Using the digital evidence he had so carelessly archived, they exposed the bet not only as emotional manipulation but as contractual fraud under state law, voiding all claims Jace had to several of the properties purchased under the marriage trust. The final nail came in a letter from her attorney, a clean, emotionless notification that a judge had granted Mara full rights to the brownstone they once lived in together, now used as a community women's center. It wasn't revenge. It was recalibration. A correction. She hadn't just walked away. She had walked upward, leaving a trail of consequences in her graceful silence. Jace didn't fight it. He signed the transfer paperwork without a fuss, walked out of the courthouse without speaking, and disappeared into a life of anonymity. His name was no longer cursed or celebrated. It simply vanished. Occasionally, someone from his old world would send a message, an olive branch, a hint of nostalgia. He never replied. What would he say? That the joke had buried him? That the bet had forced him to look in the mirror and find nothing there? That the woman he once used as a pawn had become his compass, and he no longer had access to the direction she pointed toward? There was no poetic ending. No last chance. But sometimes, that's what redemption looks like, not a moment of cinematic apology, but a quiet life lived with regret as your shadow. Mara's world, by contrast, only grew. The community center she founded flourished. Women of all backgrounds came to find shelter, support, and skills. Her baking show was renewed for 3 more seasons. She published a second book, this time fiction, inspired by the lives of the women who came through her doors. She never spoke of Jace publicly. To the world, he was an unnamed ghost. To her, he was a chapter long closed, a man whose cruelty had become the soil in which she planted her deepest strength. She sometimes walked past their old haunts, the bench by the river where he once brought her pastries, the bookstore where he first kissed her hand. But there was no longing. Only gratitude, for the pain that taught her precision, and the betrayal that unearthed her brilliance. One evening, while walking through the bakery's new second location, she paused by the window and watched a young couple laugh over a slice of her signature brioche. They reminded her of herself, long ago. She smiled, not bitterly, but softly. She had lived a story that many wouldn't believe if it weren't true. A story where the villain lost not to vengeance, but to the very woman he underestimated. A story that began with cruelty and ended with quiet power. As she turned off the lights and locked the doors, the moonlight cast a soft glow over the sign that bore her name. Mara Kinley. Not a victim. Not a trophy. Not a bet. Just a woman who rewrote her ending, and made sure it was one no one could take from her again.